September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The air in the operations tent was thick and heavy, saturated with the unique humidity of the South Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a living legend of the Imperial Japanese Navy, ran his fingers over the crisp paper of the latest intelligence dispatch. His face, weathered by countless missions and marked by the empty socket where his left eye once been, a permanent souvenir from an encounter with an American gunner over Guadalcanal a year prior, remained impassive. Then his one good eye caught a specific passage, and a short, derisive laugh escaped his lips, a sharp, unexpected sound in the quiet tent. The report detailed a new American naval fighter, the F6F, christened Hellcat. The described specifications were absurd. It was portrayed as a behemoth, weighing in at nearly double the weight of their own pristine Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, with a wingspan as broad as some transport aircraft. The American designers, it seemed, had learned nothing. To Sakai and his comrades, this was just another clumsy, over-engineered American contraption, destined to join the countless P-40s, Buffaloes, and Wildcats that had been brushed from the sky by the nimble Zero. Through the parted flaps of the tent, Sakai could see his squadron's Zeros, lined up in perfect rows on the pierced steel planking of the runway. They gleamed in the morning sun, sleek, elegant, and deadly. For nearly 3 glorious years, these aircraft had been the undisputed masters of the Pacific theater. They had swept the skies clear at Pearl Harbor, ravaged the air forces of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, and humiliated the British over the Indian Ocean. The Zero was more than a machine. It was a symbol of Japanese ingenuity, piloting skill, and tactical supremacy. What Sakai could not possibly comprehend in that moment of confident dismissal was that the calendar had become a countdown to oblivion. In exactly 30 days, this failure of American design would begin its grim work, the systematic and utter annihilation of the very force he represented. The F6F Hellcat was not a mistake. It was a revolution. It would go on to achieve a kill ratio that defied all previous military logic. 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every one of its own lost in aerial combat. A staggering tally of 5,123 Japanese planes shot down against 270 Hellcats. It would fundamentally redefine the nature of carrier warfare, shatter the backbone of Japanese naval air power, and expose the Zero's legendary reign as a triumph built upon a foundation of fragile and ultimately fatal assumptions. The very mathematics of aerial dominance, which had so favored Japan, were about to be brutally recalculated by an aircraft that appeared all wrong, heavy, ungainly, and seemingly ignorant of the dogfighting principles Japan had perfected. Yet, within 6 months, the pilots now chuckling at the intelligence reports would be composing their final letters to their families, understanding with chilling certainty that a rendezvous with a Hellcat formation was a statistical death sentence. The rising sun of Japanese naval aviation had reached its zenith. Its confidence in September 1943 was not mere arrogance. It was, from their perspective, a conclusion supported by 2 years of unbroken mathematical victory. The era of the Zero, a reign built on revolutionary design. The confidence of the Japanese Navy was rooted in a record of staggering success. Since the devastating blow against Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the victory ratios achieved by the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service seemed almost supernatural. At Pearl Harbor, they lost a mere 29 aircraft, while destroying 347 American planes on the ground and in the air. In the Philippines, 7 Japanese losses were traded for 103 Allied aircraft. Over Darwin, Australia, the score was 2 against 30. The British Royal Air Force's Far East Command and the Dutch East Indies Air Force were systematically eliminated in a matter of days. At the heart of this dominance was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero Sen fighter. This aircraft had single-handedly rewritten the global doctrine of fighter design. When American engineers finally got their hands on a largely intact Zero that had crash-landed in the Aleutians in 1942, their initial reports were met with disbelief. How could a fighter possess the range of a medium bomber, the maneuverability of a pre-war biplane trainer, and the firepower to destroy any opponent it caught in its sights? It appeared to violate the fundamental laws of aerospace engineering. The Zero's mystical performance was achieved through a radical, almost fanatical design philosophy. The Japanese employed a secret aluminum alloy known as extra super duralumin, which was significantly stronger and lighter than its American equivalents. This allowed for an airframe that was a marvel of minimalism. To save every possible ounce, critical features were deemed unnecessary luxuries. The pilot sat unprotected by armor plate. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing, turning the aircraft into a potential firebomb with a single incendiary round. In many frontline aircraft, even the radio was removed to save a precious 30 pounds. Every component, every gram, was sacrificed on the altar of performance, range, climb rate, and turning ability. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who had become Japan's ace of aces with 87 confirmed victories, captured the essence of the Zero in his personal diary. "To fly the Zero," he wrote, "is not merely to pilot an aircraft, it is to wear wings as your own body. The machine responds not just to the stick and rudder, but to the very thought of the pilot. In comparison, the American planes fly like delivery trucks, powerful perhaps, but utterly clumsy. They build their fighters as they build their automobiles, heavy, overbuilt, and wasteful. The intelligence failure, a fatal misreading of intent. The first fragmentary reports on the F6F Hellcat filtered into Japanese intelligence channels in early 1943, often via neutral diplomatic sources like the Swedes. The specifications seemed so outlandish that they were initially dismissed as Allied propaganda or a deliberate campaign of misinformation. The numbers were jarring. A maximum takeoff weight of over 12,000 pounds compared to the Zero's 5,800, a massive, draggy Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, a wingspan that created a large wing area, and an armament of 6 heavy 50 caliber machine guns with a vast ammunition supply. It was an aircraft encumbered with 250 gallons of fuel in self-sealing tanks, armor plate protecting the pilot and critical systems, and bulletproof windscreens. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed these specifications at Combined Fleet Headquarters. His analysis, preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, was scathingly dismissive. "The Americans have comprehended nothing from their defeats," he concluded. "This Hellcat is merely a continuation of their flawed industrial philosophy, an attempt to compensate for a lack of individual pilot skill with sheer weight of machinery and brute force. A competent Zero pilot will fly circles around it, cutting it to pieces in a turning engagement." On paper, the mathematics appeared to vindicate Genda's assessment. The key metric for maneuverability, wing loading, the weight carried by each square foot of wing, was profoundly in the Zero's favor. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot granted it a phenomenally tight turning radius of just 612 feet. The Hellcat, by contrast, had a wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot, which theoretically suggested a much wider, slower turning radius of over 900 feet. In the classic turning dogfight, the central pillar of all Japanese fighter pilot training, the Hellcat appeared to be a hopelessly sluggish and vulnerable target. The first shocking encounters, the paradigm shifts. The theoretical met the real on September 30th, 1943, near Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui, an experienced pilot, was escorting a reconnaissance plane when he spotted 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast. His first impression, noted in his after-action report, was of B-25 Mitchell bombers on an unusual heading. Then the formation banked, and he saw the truth. single-engine fighters with a massive, barrel-like fuselage and wings that seemed oddly truncated. These were the Hellcats. First encounter with F6F type fighter. He would meticulously record. Initial impression: the Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. Fukui reacted as he had been trained, initiating the standard Zero tactic. He rolled into a steep, diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to continue straight or attempt a clumsy, wide turn, allowing him to curve effortlessly onto its vulnerable tail. Instead, the impossible happened. The Hellcat did not run. It pointed its nose sharply upward and climbed, its massive engine propelling it skyward at a rate that left the Zero struggling. The Pratt & Whitney R2800, producing over 2,000 horsepower, a staggering 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, drove the Hellcat upward at over 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui, attempting to follow, felt his airspeed bleed away as gravity relentlessly pulled on his lighter, but less powerful, Zero. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat executed a stunning hammerhead stall turn, a high-energy maneuver considered impossible for a plane of its alleged weight, and dropped directly onto Fukui's tail. The American opened fire at 400 meters. Fukui reported. The volume of fire was unprecedented. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we had anticipated. My aircraft was struck by 17 rounds in the space of 3 seconds. Only by throwing his Zero into a violent, uncontrolled spin did Fukui manage to escape. He limped back to Marcus Island, his aircraft riddled with holes. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao, and the reconnaissance plane they were protecting did not return. First blood had been drawn, and it belonged to the Hellcat. The paradox of weight was becoming terrifyingly clear. On October 5, 1943, during an American raid on Wake Island, Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros to intercept a group of Hellcats. They held the ultimate tactical advantage: altitude, the sun at their backs, and the element of surprise. Victory was certain. Shiga confided in his diary. As the Zeros dove on the Hellcats, the American fighters did not break formation and scatter. They held together, nosing into a gentle dive to maintain their high speed. When the Zeros opened fire at long range, the 20mm cannon shells and 7.7mm bullets seemed to have little effect, sparking harmlessly off the Hellcat's armor or being absorbed by its self-sealing tanks. The Zero's lightweight construction, once its greatest strength, was now a fatal weakness. Its limited ammunition was quickly expended in these ineffective passes. Then the Hellcats counterattacked. They did not attempt to turn and dogfight. They used their weight and power as a weapon, climbing back to altitude with ease. At 25,000 feet, where the Zero's engine gasped for air and power output plummeted, the Hellcat's supercharged engine was still producing formidable power. "They came down on us like hawks on sparrows," Shiga wrote with despair. "Their weight gave them a diving speed we could not match. They would make a single, slashing pass, fire those 6 terrible guns, and then climb away untouched before we could even bring our sights to bear." The engagement ended with 8 Zeros shot down. No Hellcats were lost. The technology gulf, a system, not just a plane. By late 1943, the technological disparity was becoming a chasm that Japanese engineers could not bridge. The Hellcat was not just a better aircraft. It was part of a vastly superior combat system. Firepower. The disparity was mathematical and devastating. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns had a combined rate of fire of 4,500 rounds per minute. Each heavy bullet traveled at high velocity and delivered immense kinetic energy, capable of shredding the Zero's lightweight airframe. The Zero's armament of 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons was potent, but hamstrung by low muzzle velocity, limited ammunition, and slower rate of fire. Survivability. The Hellcat was designed to bring its pilot home. It contained 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot's seat and back, 110 pounds protecting the engine oil cooler, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could seal up after multiple hits. The Zero, in its pursuit of lightness, had none of this. A few rounds in the wrong place were often fatal. Radar and fighter direction. This was perhaps the most decisive advantage. While Japanese pilots relied on their own sharp eyesight, Hellcat pilots were guided to their targets by shipboard radar controllers who could see Japanese formations from over 50 miles away, in darkness or through clouds. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi described the shock of this new reality. "We were climbing through a cloud layer when they hit us. There was no warning, no visual contact. The Hellcats dove from above, perfectly positioned on our heading and altitude. They knew exactly where we were. We were blind men fighting against men who could see in the dark." The human collapse, the pilot crisis. The pre-war Japanese naval aviator was a product of the world's most rigorous and selective training program. It was a 3-year ordeal that produced pilots with over 700 hours of flight time, masters of aerobatics, gunnery, and navigation. They were the samurai of the sky. By 1944, this elite corps had been bled white. The relentless tempo of combat, coupled with catastrophic losses, created an insatiable demand for replacements. The training pipeline was slashed. New naval pilots were arriving at the front with barely 300 hours, and then 200, and later even less. Critical training, night flying, instrument flight, formation tactics, gunnery practice, was abandoned due to severe fuel and ammunition shortages. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer, wrote in a desperate report, "We are sending children to fight professionals. Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. We have no ammunition for practice. He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat." Meanwhile, American pilots received standardized, thorough training in the safety of the United States, arriving in combat with a solid foundation of 300 hours, including extensive type-specific training in the Hellcat itself. They had practiced gunnery for thousands of rounds and mastered the new energy-fighting tactics, the Turkey Shoot and the final reckoning. The culmination of this divergence came on June 19, 1944, in the Philippine Sea, in a battle that would be immortalized as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy committed its entire remaining carrier force, 9 carriers with over 450 aircraft, to a decisive battle. They were met by Task Force 58's 15 carriers and nearly 1,000 aircraft, over 450 of which were F6F Hellcats. Admiral Saburo Ozawa launched his aircraft in coordinated waves. American radar picked them up at extreme range. Hellcats were vectored to perfect intercept positions, with altitude, sun, and numbers advantage. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading a Japanese fighter escort, saw the waiting Hellcats. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, at least 60 of them, waiting like a steel curtain. The result was a slaughter. In one of the most one-sided aerial battles in history, the Japanese lost 346 carrier-based aircraft in a single day. American losses from all causes were 30 aircraft. American pilots like Commander David McCampbell of Air Group 15 shot down 7 aircraft in a single mission. The tactics were simple and devastating. The Hellcats would make high-speed, slashing passes, using their superior power and dive speed to avoid turning fights, then climb back to safety to repeat the process. The Zeros, trying to turn with them, would stall and become easy prey. The psychological impact was terminal. A condition the Japanese later termed Hellcat psychosis set in among the surviving pilots. They had lost faith in their equipment, their tactics, and their chances of survival. Admiral Ozawa himself reported, "The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved the industrialization of air combat. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, were engaging not individual planes, but a vast, integrated system." By the war's final year, the situation had deteriorated into a desperate, tragic finale. the Kamikaze Campaign. This was the ultimate admission of defeat. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the father of the special attack units, justified it with chilling logic. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, the probability of success is near zero, for the Hellcats will destroy it. If the Zero becomes a bomb, the probability increases. The pilot dies either way. At least this way, his death has meaning. The nation that had once fielded the world's most skilled naval aviators was now reduced to using them as guided missiles, a final desperate attempt to inflict damage when aerial victory was no longer possible. The aftermath and the judgment of history. By August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had ceased to exist. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who began the war, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained. The F6F Hellcat ended the war with a final, staggering tally. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat for the loss of 270 of its own, a kill ratio of 19.1. It had produced 305 U.S. Navy aces and accounted for 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air victories in the war. When American occupation forces landed at Atsugi Airfield, the first aircraft to touch down were F6F Hellcats. Japanese personnel lined the runways, staring in a mixture of fear and awe at the machine that had been their nemesis. American aces like Lieutenant Robert Bob Vaquer performed casual aerobatic demonstrations that left the Japanese pilots stunned. The maneuvers would have torn the wings off a Zero. In the decades that followed, veterans from both sides reflected on the conflict. Captain David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's top ace, stated simply, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period." Commander Saburo Sakai, the legendary Japanese ace who survived the war, offered a more profound and poignant epitaph. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until it was too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The ultimate lesson of the Hellcat was not merely one of engineering, but of national philosophy. The Japanese had perfected the warrior. The Americans had perfected the system that built, supported, and empowered the warrior. The extra weight the Japanese had mocked, the armor, the self-sealing tanks, the powerful radio, the massive engine, was not weakness. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial democracy's commitment to protecting its citizens in uniform. It represented a nation that could produce a superior weapon in overwhelming numbers, flown by well-trained pilots and integrated into a seamless web of radar, communications, and logistics. The F6F Hellcat was the embodiment of this total war machine, and its final grim laugh was the sound of an era ending, as the age of the samurai pilot was irrevocably closed by the relentless, systematic efficiency of modern industrial warfare. The occupation revelation. Confronting the reality. In the weeks following the surrender, the sheer scale of the American industrial and technological machine became terrifyingly clear to the Japanese. As engineers and pilots were allowed to inspect the Hellcats up close at Atsugi and other bases, their initial disbelief turned to a grim understanding. The aircraft they had dismissed as a clumsy brute was, in fact, a masterpiece of optimized design and rugged engineering. Japanese mechanics, renowned for their own craftsmanship, marveled at the Hellcat's construction. They noted the thick, resilient skin of the aircraft, the robust landing gear designed for punishing carrier landings, and the incredible accessibility of the engine and systems for maintenance. Every component was built for durability and ease of repair in the field, a stark contrast to the delicate, hand-fitted Zero, which required meticulous care. The concept of interchangeability, where a part from one Hellcat could be installed on another without custom fitting, was a revelation that spoke volumes about American mass production capabilities. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the brilliant and tormented designer of the Zero, conducted a thorough post-mortem of the Hellcat. His findings, published after the war, were a devastating indictment of Japan's strategic short-sightedness. "We were tasked with creating the perfect sword for a duel," he wrote, "and we succeeded magnificently. But the Americans, understanding the nature of the coming conflict, did not build a better sword. They industrialized the entire duel. They built a factory that produced trained duelists, a system to guide them to the fight, and a weapon that could withstand our blows while delivering a killing strike. The Zero was a work of art. The Hellcat was a tool of victory. We designed an aircraft for the war we wanted to fight in 1941. They designed a system for the war they knew they had to win in 1945. The production miracle. The arsenal of democracy in action. The statistics of production alone told a story of inevitable defeat. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation's plant in Bethpage, New York, was a manifestation of the arsenal of democracy. It operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, its lights a constant beacon of relentless output. The production lines were a model of efficiency, utilizing color-coded instructions and standardized procedures that allowed workers of varying skill levels to contribute to the complex assembly process. At its peak, a new, fully equipped F6F Hellcat rolled off the line and was prepared for shipment to the Pacific every 60 minutes. In the 30 months of its production run, Grumman produced 275 Hellcats. To put this in perspective, in the entire year of 1944, the year of the Turkey Shoot and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan managed to produce only 500 fighters of all types, including outdated models. The United States, in that same year, produced over 35,000 fighter aircraft. This was not a competition. It was an avalanche burying an entire industry. The Japanese military, which had believed the spirit of the warrior could overcome material disadvantage, found itself crushed by the sheer, unimaginable weight of American industrial might. The strategic revolution, redefining naval power. The Hellcat's impact transcended aerial combat. It fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of naval warfare. Pre-war doctrine, shared by both navies, held that aircraft carriers were inherently vulnerable, eggshells armed with hammers. The strategy was to locate the enemy first and launch a preemptive knockout strike. The Hellcat, integrated with radar and efficient command and control, inverted this doctrine. Under admirals like Raymond Spruance and Mark Mitchell, the American Fast Carrier Task Force, TF-3858, became a mobile, unsinkable fortress. With the Hellcat, Admiral Mitchell stated, "We don't need to find them first. Let them come. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience, on our terms." This confidence granted the U.S. Navy unprecedented strategic freedom. They could launch sustained operations off the very coast of Japan itself, as they did during the raids on Tokyo and the invasion of Okinawa. The Hellcat umbrella provided a defensive shield so effective that it allowed the fleet to operate for weeks within range of hundreds of land-based Japanese airfields, systematically destroying the enemy's remaining air power and industrial base with near impunity. The carrier was no longer a raider, it was a bastion of power projection. The cultural and philosophical collision. The conflict between the Zero and the Hellcat was, at its core, a clash of two irreconcilable philosophies of war. Japanese military culture, steeped in the Bushido Code, emphasized individual honor, spiritual purity, relentless offense, and a glorious death in service to the emperor. The pilot was a knight, and the Zero was his exquisite, personalized sword. The Hellcat, and the system it represented, embodied the American philosophy of systematic, industrial warfare. It valued teamwork, technology, survivability, and the conservation of human life. The pilot was a highly skilled component in a vast, lethal machine. The concept of using the machine to its full potential, which included breaking off an engagement if disadvantaged, a core tenet of Hellcat boom and zoom tactics, was anathema to the Japanese ethos of constant attack. This philosophical gulf meant that even when Japanese pilots understood the Hellcat's tactics intellectually, they were culturally and psychologically incapable of fully adapting to them. They continued to try to turn and fight, playing directly into the Hellcat's hands. The final reckoning and enduring legacy. The legacy of the F6F Hellcat is etched in the cold, hard mathematics of war, numbers that tell a story of total dominance. Kill ratio, 19-1 overall, and an estimated 13.1 specifically against the Zero. Production, 1,275 Hellcats built. Aces, 305 U.S. Navy aces created in the type. Japanese losses. Of the 18,000 pre-war naval aviators, fewer than 100 combat-capable pilots remained by August 1945. Admiral Saburo Ozawa, who commanded the defeated fleet at the Philippine Sea, provided the ultimate, sober assessment. We laughed at the Hellcat initially because we failed to understand that it represented not just a new aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to war. It was the product of a society that could master physics, mass production, and complex logistics. By the time we stopped laughing and realized what we were truly facing, our naval air arm had already ceased to exist. The last word belongs to the men who fought. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, who lived until the year 2000, carried the memory of the Hellcat's dominance for the rest of his life. In one of his final interviews, he was asked to reflect on his former adversary. His response was a masterpiece of painful clarity. The Zero made Japan feel like a great naval power. It was a symbol of our spirit and our skill. But the Hellcat taught Japan the most humbling lesson of its modern history. It showed us that we were never as great as we believed. We thought we were samurai, destined for glory. The Hellcat proved we were just men with outdated weapons, staring into the face of the future. And the most profound, the most complete defeat of all is the realization that every Japanese pilot who survived the war, myself included, only did so because a Hellcat pilot at some point chose to let us live. We existed at our enemy's discretion. There is no greater defeat than that. The F6F Hellcat entered the war as a seemingly flawed design, mocked for its weight and size. But every extra pound, the armor that saved a pilot's life, the fuel that extended its range, the engine that gave it power, the radios that coordinated its attacks, was not a sign of weakness. It was the tangible expression of a nation's resolve to protect its warriors and win through overwhelming systemic superiority. The Japanese pilots laughed at it in 1943 because they saw only a machine. By 1945, they saw it for what it was, the harbinger of their inevitable and total defeat. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did.